Hello and welcome back to the Humanities and Social Sciences teaching. I'm going to turn it right over to Dr. Wendy Wright and Dr. Lucy Manguia. Dr. Wright.
Hi, thank you so much for creating this. This is, I'm very, very grateful to be part of an academic community that takes these issues seriously and is engaged in these ways. Before I get started, I did want to just acknowledge that both I'm from my home right now, but also from campus, both exist on unceded Lenape land. So even as we kind of think about the Capitol and our own spaces as who we are, it's also in settler colonial context is kind of our primary engagement here. So thank you. All right. I'm going to talk today about thinking about threats and thinking about who has access to threats and make sure, let me double check, excuse me for just a second. And the way the threat is a constructed reality, and that the power to define threat and then respond to those threats is part of the context and part of the thing we need to understand in terms of assessing the breach of the Capitol on January 6th. And so first, I want to start out kind of thinking about perceptions of threat. And I've got a poll here I'm going to launch. And I would like you to, as we jump in here and kind of prime ourselves thinking about threat, what do you think is the biggest threat? So we have here the hippopotamus, mosquitoes, sharks, and lions. And these are kind of, non-threatening versions of these creatures. But I want you to gauge your own threat. So pick whichever one in the poll here that Jim's going to launch, which is the most threatening. If you can give people just a minute to respond to that, Jim.
Is the poll working?
No, I can't see it.
See, Wendy, if you can launch it, you should be able to do it from the bottom for some reason.
Okay. Launch polling, continue.
And that drop down should be your question. I apologize.
Not at all. Oh, next drop down. Most dangerous. Yes. Maybe. What are you? Can you? Here you go. I think you guys can see it now. Oh, nope. It just switched to a different one again. How odd. Can you guys see it now? No. Yes.
Yes, we see it now.
Right. Excellent. All right, got a couple more seconds here. Make your decisions. We've got about 73% of you have voted. Like 5 more seconds and then I'll end it. I'll see if I can successfully do that. Okay. And I'm going to share these results and compare them to lethality. So 64% of you were correct in guessing or knowing that the mosquito is the most dangerous of these creatures. Annually, mosquitoes kill approximately 1 million people. That's a lot of people compared to shark got 17%. Annually, sharks kill about 6 people. And that's like often a high. 4 is, I think there were 2 last year. Lions kill about 100 people, and hippos kill about 500 people each year. And so we see like what feels particularly threatening often does not match up with the reality of threat. And while that's kind of true in a number of ways, when we begin to add in other social complexities, it becomes a greater challenge for politics, for living, kind of how we think about democracy. And that's where I want to move from now. So thinking about racism. So right now, I'd like to introduce just a couple of terms here. So one, complicate our definition of racism. Here I want to go to a definition of racism by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, a geographer. And she argues that racism specifically is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So this is a pretty complicated and theoretical construction of racism that is pushing back on the idea that racism is simply kind of an affective thing in terms of like white people being prejudiced against Black people, but instead wants to emphasize the centrality of power. And that's what I think is very, very key here. We're talking about state sanctioned so that the government is okay with it, or extra legal. It's happening either beyond the boundaries of the law. So the law doesn't touch these forms of power. Also think about group differentiated. In the 21st century, one of the things that many scholars are looking at is the ways that the boundaries of race are redefining or being redefined. And that when whiteness is fundamentally about access to certain kinds of capital, there are going to be times when folks are going to try to ally themselves to that capital. And so we see, the leader, maybe former leader now, because it turned out he was an FBI informant of the Proud Boys, is a Latino man. Christina Beltran, a cultural studies theorist, argues that what we're seeing there is multiracial whiteness, kind of as these structures become more clearly about power, accessing that power becomes a political strategy. And so these definitions, I want to kind of frame our discussion of threat moving forward. And that question up at the top right there. So who is a threat? Backing up away from the Capitol, thinking about the last few years, the killings of unarmed Black people have become a more important element of our discourse. And one of the things in terms of, again, the state-sanctioned or extra-legal part of racism is that one of the standards of whether the law is going to hold someone accountable for a death, a police killing, or like Trayvon Martin was not killed by a police officer, but someone acting kind of in the name of public safety in the law. The law determines that these are legal killings if they are reasonable, if the person reasonably believed that there was a potentially lethal threat. And so this belief about a threat, when it becomes kind of tied into racial ideology, ends up with a scenario in which people who are unarmed, who do not pose a kind of material threat, children, so we have someone like Tamir Rice playing with a toy in a playground. You have someone like Breonna Taylor sleeping in her house, Trayvon Martin walking around his neighborhood, Willie McCoy, who was sleeping in his car, all get constructed as sufficient threats as to require lethal violence to respond to them. And just a few days ago, we can think about in the news was this 9-year-old girl who was having a kind of family crisis, a mental health crisis. And the police response was to handcuff and pepper spray her. That is defensible under the law when the subject of that violence is constructed as a particular kind of threat. And I want to kind of juxtapose these kinds of visions of socially constructed threat with the events at the Capitol and protests and actions leading up to that date. So what I'm arguing here is that Blackness, because of ideologies of racism, kind of embodies in the social mind, in the minds of power, a kind of threat in the minds of policing, for example. But whiteness is actually kind of reconstructed as innocent, even when there's lots of evidence to the contrary. And so in the kind of months leading up to January 6th, we saw an escalation in use of both promise to violence, semiotic violence, so symbolic violence, linguistic violence, threats of violence. So we have the folks who were planning to kidnap the governor of Michigan. We saw an increase of armed protests, anti-mask protests, etc. Lots of guns. And then on the days of the Capitol itself, we see a lot of imagery. So here we have images of Oath Keepers, which is a militia that has a strong kind of white nationalist identity. You have folks like the guy wearing a Camp Auschwitz t-shirt. So literally kind of a celebration, a tongue-in-cheek celebration of genocide. And then very literally on your right, this is a gentleman, even see the framing of these language, right? Mr. Rhodes, who's an Oath Keeper, who was quoted as saying that if Trump did not overthrow the government after the legitimate election, where there was consistently no evidence that this was a fraudulent election, actually like GOP, like GOP appointed conservative DHS appointees had said this is actually the most secure election in a very long time, so that if there was not an overturning of democracy, it would be in a much more desperate, much more bloody war. And yet, despite all of this evidence, one of the things I'm going to argue here is that these protesters were not seen as a threat. And that's part of why, say, the Capitol Police were not prepared to meet a mass protest. There's this construction of these protesters as rational, reasonable, they would make the right choices. And so you don't need, say, the force of the state, the force of the law to combat them. And then there's the other side of this that is kind of simultaneous, running parallel here, is that you have a lot of folks in government, because remember at the time, the reason this was a political event was because people were, because both members of Congress on both sides of the aisle were, or on both sides, both the Senate and the House, were refusing to certify the election, that these kinds of rejections of the rule of democracy are actually beneficial, and so that they don't actually even construct a threat. And that's, I want to leave it there because I don't want to go too long, but I want to pose these questions about how we see threat as kind of being created, our narratives of threat being created in the media, in various social and political spaces. How do we push against these material judgments? And what are the potential political and moral consequences of that? I'm going to stop that and turn it over to Dr. Munguia.
Hi, thank you so much, Wendy, and everyone for organizing this really interesting event. I'm learning a lot, starting with the speakers at 9, and then, still from Wendy, despite having kind of talked about her presentation, I feel like I actually didn't know the mosquito fact. I'm allergic to mosquitoes, but I thought it was a kind of like, maybe I'm wrong at perceiving these with so much, fearfulness. Anyway, so I want to say one thing, like in response to your presentation, and then maybe link it to mine. But this idea, and it kind of relates back to Dr. Haynes's and Dr. Wallace's presentations, that in many of these situations, when people are surprised, there's a whole group of people who are sort of like not surprised, right? And largely it's because either they themselves have either like an academic awareness of the fact that our perceptions themselves are shaped by harmful ideologies, or they themselves have been like the target of ideologies, right? And like an example I shared with Wendy yesterday was, I've been pulled over before when I was like in sweatpants and a rental car, and I was with my young nephew, who's a young Black boy, and totally questioned incessantly by police officers, and very fearful myself, asking to call my partner, who is a white male, and put him on speaker so I could get some insurance information for a rental vehicle. And the first question him asking on speaker was, why are you being pulled over? And when you're calling someone, their profile picture's kind of up on your iPhone, and all of a sudden the whole situation, almost like the vibe changed. It's almost like the police officers saw me as less of a threat or less of a worry in their eyes. And they actually didn't have an answer to my partner's question, and like had to go back to the car, and then said I rolled through a stop sign, which I highly doubt, because I drive like my grandmother would drive. But I always find it really fascinating when people are expressing surprise at these like different levels of response we see in authority figures in our nation, because I think so many of us and so many people in our really diverse community at William Patterson, we either kind of know this stuff through firsthand experiences or studying it. So it's always a really interesting and important thing to bring out this idea that it's actually the perception that is shifted by the ideology. It's not just this like, really conscious and obvious belief. Like, I mean, that is the case for some people, but for, by and large, everyday people in society, these are sort of heuristics that we're relying on, the ideologies, and they are very much shaping our like physiological responses. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we're perceiving one another, but I'm going to bring a more philosophical perspective on the matter and offer that framework in addition to, Dr. Wright's. So I work in a subfield of philosophy called epistemology. Here, I'll pull up my slide. Okay, let me get my slide open. Great. So share. So I work in a subfield of philosophy called epistemology, and this is all about this. These are people like me who are obsessed with how we come to have knowledge, or if you've studied it for a long time, how little you know, okay, to make it kind of exciting. But what I want to talk about is how we perceive one another in society as having knowledge. So a concept I'm going to introduce to help frame our discussion is it's epistemic entitlement. And essentially, split this up, this is going to be this idea that someone, an individual or a group of people have this inherent right to something, or it might be framed in terms of being inherently deserving of something if you're not into the talk of rights. But specifically, epistemic entitlement is supposed to refer to people having a special right to knowledge, or having an inherently deserving, being inherently deserving of being a knower. So people seeing them as a source of knowledge or a source of information that is trustworthy. And so we perceive one another as having various levels of epistemic entitlement for so many reasons. And many of these reasons are totally fine, right? And they're super helpful. So one example I love is, the other week, my 2-year-old said something like, she picked up a banana and said, "I'm eating a banana like Maui and Moana." And my husband and I were like, "What are you talking about? There's no scene where they're eating a banana," right? And then we kind of checked ourselves and we're like, but really, who would be the better source of knowledge when it comes to Moana facts in this case? Let's be real here, right? We've had over 200 days without childcare, and she's been watching a lot of Moana. She's seen it a bunch of times. So in this case, we very quickly landed on this idea that she was more entitled to count as a knower in this case. When it comes to Moana facts, I'm going to go to my little kiddo before I go to my husband or myself. She was right. There's like a random time, like a very small scene where they have a banana on their little raft boat thing. And I mean, it's, that's a reader's assignment to go find that one. At any rate, there are other reasons we, might give someone or treat someone as though they're entitled to having this role of being a knower. A show I really liked recently is this Bobby Flay and Giada Going to Italy show. It's like really inspiring after cooking for myself and my family so many times and basically like despising food at this point. It's kind of reimagining, my food options. At any rate, at the very first kind of scene, Bobby Flay's walking around and setting the tone for the show. And he says something like, "I consider myself a Roman local because I've lived here and I fell in love with the place and I know so many things about Rome." And then he brings Giada, and this is like the premise of the first few episodes. We're trying to figure out as an audience, is Bobby Flay gonna count as a Roman local after he shows Giada all these cool secret eateries? And, we land on the answer, no. Giada's like, you gotta have some more Italian skills, as in speaking the language, to count as a local. But, we kind of trust Giada in this case, right? We're like, she's probably the one who's right, not Bobby Flay. Why? Well, we're gonna get to that. Similarly, certain other things might take place in our lives where we kind of go to certain people for information over others. So like, say you adopt a kid and you wish to know how to add a dependent to your accounts, right, in your institution. And my question is like, do you ask a philosophy professor or one of the HR professionals? And it's obvious that you're going to go to the HR professional unless you want to lecture on like the concept of being a dependent or something, right? Anyway, so these examples are supposed to show that there are so many reasons out there why we think people can be entitled to say that they know over other people, that they have the special position of being the knowledge holder, right? In the case of the Moana example, my kid has perceived this movie so many times. So their own perceptions, our awareness of their experience in the world, their access to data, that is a reason we think people are entitled to have knowledge. It's why we trust, say, scientists over non-scientists when we're asking questions about like epidemiology, I hope. Another reason is their role in an institution, right? Oh, I swapped these, but the HR professional has a certain role and you can't get that role without presumably having a certain type of knowledge, your specialization. And so we think that you're entitled to say over other people who might not be experts. And then with the Giada case, I'm thinking, Giada grew up in Italy and her mom lives in Rome and she's always in Rome. She has this identity that is like really wrapped up with this sort of knowledge and a history there. Now, what I want to show and bring about is that, philosophers have been really interested in all these reasons we can claim epistemic entitlement. And in particular, one of the reasons that have been recently really relevant is race. So we have seen through history that things like race, gender, class, you know, all these things, your sexual orientation, your abledness, your level of ability to navigate our society as it's constructed, all of these features have been historically associated with people being treated as knowers or not as knowers, okay? Or people being or credible sources of knowledge or not. And one philosopher, Miranda Fricker, really honed in on one way in which we treat people differently on the basis of their credibility as knowers. Miranda Fricker talked about this idea. She introduced this idea of testimonial injustice, which is essentially this idea that, like, it's an act of rejecting somebody's claims purely on the basis of some sort of like unjust ideology, right? So we have judgments of their credibility based on racism or sexism or classism or some harmful ideology. Now, just like a really simple example here, you know, if I were to basically say to my child, you're wrong, Moana doesn't eat a banana in this movie, I've never seen this, that would be a rejection of, you know, her testimony, in essence. And that's what Fricker has in mind here. But instead of, I kind of also think that would be an injustice to my child, but that's a separate discussion. But what Fricker's really highlighting in her work from 2007 is how this is playing out with racism and sexism, et cetera. So an example that she uses to show that this has been kind of tracking racial ideologies is this example from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. Many of us are familiar with this book, but I will just very briefly lay out the situation. Tom Robinson is a Black man who's accused of raping a white townsperson, Mayala Ewell. And you know, Atticus Finch is this brave legal representative who agrees to take on his case and defend him. Throughout the course of this court case, as you see in the book, Atticus Finch presents really logical and convincing arguments towards his innocence. For instance, he had like an injury or like some kind of like problem with his arm that would make it impossible for him to have created the trauma we saw on Mayala's body and all these other things. And, you know, Atticus Finch is very successful actually in one way. He does convince the townspeople of Maycomb, that's the fictional town they're in, that Mayala Ewell and her father are fabricating this story about Tom, right? He presents enough evidence that they start talking trash about the Ewells behind their back. They're essentially like, oh, they're liars and you can't trust them. But here's the thing, the jury made up of these townspeople still convict Robinson. Okay, so they reject his testimony of his innocence. And the philosopher Miranda Fricker wants us to look at this case as an instance of rejecting someone on the basis of, like, you know, not evidence, but this harmful ideology. And the idea is something like, if they accept what he's saying about the case, namely that Mayala Ewell came onto him and he rejected her, they have to accept a whole new story about their position in society. And they're not willing to relent that their superior position in society. That's like a really shorthand version of that. Another reason, though, that we give people, or people acquire epistemic entitlement, is that authority figures and leaders in society themselves, like, don't correct people when they're wrong. Okay. And, you know, we saw this a lot in the Trump presidency, but honestly, we see this all of the time. And This is going to relate to something I say in a couple minutes, but essentially it's going to be like on us to call people out, even within our own group, when we see inconsistencies and when we see falsehoods or even like a misframing of fact, right? It's so important because when authority figures do not challenge someone's claim to have knowledge or question it, that leads to the tacit acceptance of their epistemic entitlement, okay? They sustain that role as a knower. Another way we see it is some people just kind of assert that they're credible, right? So we used to have a concept of fake news that was actually quite functional because it would home in on things like this, like the National Enquirer or this Weekly World News, where there were like random images of extraterrestrials like associated, like, oh, I found an extraterrestrial in my backyard, more crop circles. That's not to like offend you if you're into those. I really like thinking about extraterrestrials and whether we do have evidence of them. So like we could have a talk about that later. But you know, back in the day, this is what fake news referred to, right? National Enquirer and all these things. So asserting epistemic credibility happened, as we saw leading up to these events at the Capitol, when we saw the reappropriation of this term by the former president, right? So as of July 24, 2017, he had tweeted the term, the phrase fake news 73 times to describe articles that were critical of him. And then instead, I don't know if many of you knew this. Let me share this screen with you. Where is it? Hold on. But there was also a GOP fake news awards handed out in 2017, and we can get to the details of why that is relevant later. But essentially, any news source that admitted to having misstated facts or needing to have corrections in their stories, the GOP awarded them with a fake news award. Okay, so when they accepted accountability for stating something false and corrected it, that was seen as like, you're not trustworthy anymore. So then what that sort of leads to is people basically refusing to see any other source of information as credible and having this really strong sense of epistemic entitlement themselves, or attributing that entitlement to one source. And, you know, after the election, the mayor of Sundown, Texas was criticized, I want to say lightly, by some media representatives, because he expressed his views on the election, and he said that the only condition upon which he would change his views is if Trump told him that Biden had won the election. And so he was essentially like, this could not have been the case. Biden didn't win. There's no way in hell, was his direct quote when interviewed by someone from Reuters. And then he said, you know, Trump is the only one we've been able to trust for the last 4 years. Oh, and so essentially I want to frame these events as this idea that, like, you know, one of the reasons we see this insurrection is this idea that there is, like, knowing something is like a currency. It's like valuable in our society, and only certain people have access to being knowers, right? And we're not open, not necessarily, well, we all are not open to being wrong and to imagining ourselves as not knowers. But more so, we see in certain groups this idea that knowledge itself, access to truth and information, it really became part of the narrative leading up to those events, right? These people are just writing they're just writing falsehoods. We're the ones who occupy the role as knowers. And so when you're fighting for truth, it feels good, right? It feels powerful, and it feels like the right thing to do. So like many people, though, I have trouble being wrong. You can ask my husband. I mean, it sucks being married to a philosopher, skilled arguer, I would say. But in reality, we all have this kind of fear of being wrong, right? And so I wanted to launch a little poll. Oh no, I see Jim's walking away, but I can launch the poll, I think. Yes, I believe I can. So I wanted to give a little, this is a belief check-in that I want to start our discussion with. So yeah, tell me, what do you think of your own beliefs and your own position as a knower? How true are your beliefs? We only have about 73% of people chiming in, so maybe we'll leave the poll up for like another 50 seconds or so. Okay, so I wanted to share the results, and 90% of the participants in the poll believe that most of their beliefs are true. I should have put like a half and half, though it's really hard to know what my beliefs are, and you can come to some of my classes in the philosophy department and know why. But anyway, yeah, this is like really common that many of us think most of our beliefs are true. 5% of you think all of your beliefs are true and none of your beliefs are false. And that's fascinating. And then 5% of you think all of your beliefs are false. So you're basically like Descartes. And you can, again, if you want to learn more about that dude, you can go to the philosophy department and take some fun classes. But yeah, so essentially I want to share these results, and then I also want to kind of just talk about a solution to this that, I mean, it's idealistic and we can talk about why it might fail. But I think obviously, if we want to know, if we want to figure out how to improve communications with people, prevent all this talking past each other and resort to violence, as a society, we obviously need to be more open to being wrong. I mean, not to burst your bubbles, but almost everyone's beliefs have like a ton of falsehoods in them, just because like we don't have access to all the evidence we need to really have like truth. And so being open to that reality would be like a really good start. So how do you be open to that? One of the big things my research has begun to like go in is looking at these things called epistemic emotions. These are essentially like the feelings we get related to our beliefs. So when you've made a mistake, like you thought you knew something and then you were wrong and you feel some shame, like you get an answer on a test wrong, that's a really important emotion, to be aware of that emotion and understand that that's really what's at stake for people who hold on firmly to beliefs in the face of counter evidence, right? So my kiddo's crying, but there are some other emotions we should also pay attention to. And this is one that I think we don't really talk about a lot. So pride. that feeling of excitement or glee, right? That it's indicative of pride for being in the know. So you know a secret that your other friends don't have access to, right? Something like that. That's also like a really important emotion for community building and being involved in something, being accepted, right? So these are all emotions that we can kind of like perceive in others and in ourselves, or, you know, and so my suggestion is like being aware that our epistemic entitlements are tied to emotional responses, and that there is a pain in admitting you're wrong might maybe open our kind of route to discussing the significance of our own entitlement and understand better events like the ones that transpired at the Capitol. That's all I have to say. It was already a lot, so let's discuss.
Okay, as a quick reminder, please write to Tia Cherry or myself for questions, or raise your hand if you want to engage directly. Lucy, would you stop sharing, please? Okay, first question is going to be from Pete Mandick, and he is going to ask his question. Pete, you're still muted. Well, why is Pete not? Yeah, you're not coming through, Pete.
How about that? How about now?
There you go.
I apologize. So this is for my colleague from the philosophy department, Professor Munguia. My question is about epistemic entitlement and whether you think that in all cases of epistemic entitlement, what you have is just something that would be a consequence of empiricism, the view that our knowledge is grounded in the senses, or if there's something else going on. And just to elaborate, if like the case with the banana, and spoiler alert, Maui is eating banana on the raft. In that case, your child, they've seen the movie a lot more. They have access to sensory data that you don't have, or you had and you forgot. So that seems like just a straightforward empiricist sort of thing. But there's other cases in which someone is in a position to make a knowledge claim because, for example, in certain circumstances, an umpire or a referee, they have the authority to just make the call. So it's something else besides like, well, they saw it. There's certain cases in which also like a trial judge might be able to just like, or a professor might, just decide that your grade is an A- because they have the authority to do so. So it's not really about the evidence that they have, but the special position that they're in to just, as George W. Bush would say, be the decider. They just decide that's what the fact is, and that's what grounds their knowledge claim. So the question is, in all cases, are we just dealing with the consequence of empiricism, or are there at least some cases of epistemic entitlement where it's really about having a certain sort of status to be a decider, or just something else that goes beyond empiricism? That's the question.
I love that question. I think it's a little bit of both, right? So what's interesting, and maybe this is something I think we should be thinking about, like kind of how it's playing out in the political sphere a little, but like in the case of the people who are really committed to the truth of conspiracy theories, like the current trending conspiracy theory in particular, there is a status thing there, right? It's very, very much about rejecting what we can perceive as something that is like a deep fake or a fraudulent kind of source for us to perceive, right? Or fraudulent piece of information being represented. Now, for those people, I very much think it's like an interesting combination of that's leading to epistemic entitlement. It's this idea that there's like this mysterious person or being communicating and saying basically like, this is the trustworthy source on earth or something. And, you know, a long time ago, like the time of like, I don't know, John Austin, this is like an old philosopher for many of you, long gone. But there's this really interesting thing going on where certain people in society truly did take themselves to be like the prophets, or at least to be conveying some kind of truth that was like communicated from a divine source, right? So it wasn't this visible connection of like empirical findings leading to their authority epistemically. It was more just like a divine command or access to divine, you know, truth. And you know, Austin was a kind of afraid of that. So at any rate, the idea is that, you know, I think it comes from many sources, and we see this like, you know, if any of you had experience with religion, like I have, you know, it's also really embedded there too. You kind of just have faith and you assume that certain people in certain roles have more access to knowledge than you do. And you might seek them out as resources to help you go through life's issues. So I think it comes from both. And what's interesting is like the status quo is, you know, science, and that is what's being rejected. So we actually see leading up to the Capitol events, I think a very strong rejection of empiricism. And that makes for like an interesting thing to think about.
Okay. Next question, Tia has the next question.
Thank you so much, Jim. I have a question from a student. They wanted to know, do you have an example of epistemic entitlement in an ethically diverse classroom setting, and how can it be addressed?
Oh my gosh, I love this. So yes, I do. And I'll just say, this is kind of going back to, I think, Dr. Haynes and also Dr. Wright's point that like we all face these challenges to being equitable towards everyone, right? And so anyway, I used to teach at Syracuse University. I did some graduate coursework there, and I was a TA. That's a huge sports school. I'm not sure if you're aware. They have like some of the top teams in basketball, football, just really huge sports school. And I always remembered when I had a lot of football players in my sections, I'd be like, oh, great. I'm gonna have to work so hard to get them just to pass because they don't know how to do philosophy, because all they care about is like going to class, doing the minimal work, and, you know, getting the grade that they need to play, to get out there and be on I don't know, what is the sports channel? ESPN, that's the thing. They want to make it to March Madness, right? So I was dealing with some people who are like really high level athletes, and I was giving them like very little epistemic entitlement. And I grade anonymously. So I remember one time I was like reading these like essays and grading them. And then when I went to enter the grades, I was like, oh my God, this like top scorer for our basketball team got the highest essay grade in my class. And, you know, I was just like really surprised. And I thought to myself, like, why am I surprised? That's messed up, you know, that, and this happens a lot. It might not happen at a place like William Patterson as much, but it could. And that's why, you know, one project I'm working on, it has to be so perfect to get it out there, is this paper on surprise. That like sometimes we can be surprised by people when they're kind of spitting knowledge, right? And we're like, how do you know that? Or do you really know that? And that surprise might be indicative that we ourselves have these sort of, we've made these claims about who's entitled to be a knower and who is not. So from my point of view as an educator, now I'm very open to surprise. Like if I feel at all surprised that someone in my class has said something, I need to say, why am I surprised? You know, and what is the sort of belief leading to this response, right? So I don't know if that is a good answer or not, but.
Okay, any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand if you want to speak directly, or put in the chat to myself or Tia. Okay, we have a question. This is from Ryan Tower. Do you think the growing political divide is increasing our inability to question the leaders on our own sides or even admit our mistakes?
I mean, I don't know if Dr. Wright has, I obviously have a lot to say. I'm a philosopher, so it's always hard to get us to shut up. But yes, absolutely. And I think, so here's the thing. If you want a little taste of challenging someone you agree with, just watch one of those comedy shows like John Oliver or Stephen Colbert, and then try to find examples of people in your party doing the same things that they are calling out and making fun of. You know, this is something I do to my husband. He was in that target demographic when those shows were popular, so he still follows them. And I'm like, I don't find this funny because I find it hypocritical that we can laugh at this party for making this mistake. Yet we have so many examples of our own party making this mistake and we don't bat an eye. You know, so I think it has made it really hard. The polarization makes it so hard to raise critique within a party. And in many ways, I can never be on board with insurrection. I would never support that deep level of like not understanding or even wanting to hear facts. But one thing I do understand is that many people in our country are aware that politicians are like horrible, right? And not like, they're not bad people. They're just like inconsistent. They're human, just like us. And they're not putting that reality out there. The picture we get on the screen isn't a real human who makes mistakes. And in fact, accepting that you've made a mistake and being accountable for your mistakes on either side is kind of looked at like a weakness. And so it makes it hard for us ourselves to kind of attribute that weakness within our group. And so I think it is really important to, you know, really challenge every side of things and your own knowledge, question whether you even have knowledge often. I think that is like so important. We've lacked epistemic humility in an important way. Do you want to add, Dr. Wright?
Yeah, just thinking about like the ways in which this is something new and something not new. I think so. There are a couple of things here. I think one thing that's happening is that the parties are much more, in some ways, less ideologically diverse than they have been at most points in American history. There used to be a conservative wing of the Democratic Party and a liberal wing of the Democratic Party. There used to be a progressive wing of the Republican Party and a progressive wing of the, you get it. Both parties had both. And what we've seen over the past 50 to 30 years is kind of a separating out that certain kinds of conservatism are exclusive to the Republican Party and other kinds of progressivism are exclusive to the Democratic Party. And a lot of that is cohering around issues of identity, race, gender, not so much class, but class becomes embedded in certain ways. And so in that sense, I think it's more difficult to challenge kind of party ideology because there's less gradation between these parties. But on the other hand, I think that in terms of challenging those beliefs, I think that the humans tend to work like this. And I'm thinking about, say, the proliferation of ideologies previously. And remember, this is not the most divided this country has ever been. I feel like I hear that people like, we're so divided right now. We had a big war, like a big one, killed a lot of people. And I think it's like important to remember that like Charles Sumner was beat nearly to death on the floor of the Senate. You know, that was more divided. But the investment in ideology was just as strong. And so like you see across like the 18th and into the, or starting in the 18th, kind of getting really aggressive in the 19th century, the rise of race science, the kind of folks trying to prove that people of different racial descent were like different and maybe even different species. And And that was, how common in the public discourse that was, I think does speak to how power-based ideologies are always strong, always require resistance. And like Lucy said previously, that there are always knowers in society. There are always folks, and typically people who are subject to power have insight into how that power is working in a different way from people who are on the privileged position of power. So the parties are different, but I don't think the knowledge or the investment in knowledge is that different.
Okay, again, if you have any questions, direct them to Tia or myself, or just raise your hand if you want to engage directly.
If people have a second, I had something I was really thinking about from Lucy's presentation. And again, we talked yesterday, but I was sparked thinking about more things and connected to my framing of the law. So I think one of the things that's really frustrating for people particularly in saying, like, holding police accountable for police killings, or with regards to the Capitol, like, well, why isn't anyone being held accountable for not, say, having the National Guard there? And a lot of this comes to kind of this small L liberal, like John Lockean tradition that's embedded in American law, that reason and the reasonable belief is the appropriate standard. And so when police have the reasonable belief that their life is in danger, they can use lethal force. If the, I'm unclear how systems of accountability are going to be going to respond to January 6th events. But say if there were a, say, 9/11 Commission style investigation into the breach of the Capitol, I think what we would find is that you have, say, like the folks who are making decisions about who to deploy and who not being like, oh, well, I believed this, and their beliefs would be judged as reasonable and therefore not legally liable. And so that construction of, like, of what is reasonable, who is reasonable, that certain figures have that privilege of being seen as reasonable, gets embedded, both in our society and culture, but also, I mean, it's very much there at the very basic elements of our legal system.
Yeah, and it is interesting that, I think that there's a really obvious connection, right, between how threatening you feel someone is and how reasonable they are, or how much, and reasonable here could be definitely cashed out in terms of, like, how much they are relying on information that's trustworthy to back their actions and responsive to that information, right? They're not just reacting, it raises so many interesting issues about the events at the Capitol, because, like you say, they're being perceived as reasonable, maybe just expressing or exercising their right to free speech, right? But at the same time, there are so many overt, unreasonable things happening. One thing that I found was interesting too is that you did see some party leaders obviously either leave the administration, like Betsy DeVos, right? Or speak out against the administration, but it was only after all of this culminated in this event. And so all of a sudden they're like, maybe they're not going to explicitly state regret or shame, but I find that there has to be some kind of motivation there to say, like, if I didn't back out now in terms of my support of these, like, expressions of free speech or reasonable protests, then I'd be licensing this, right? And what's fascinating to me is that, like, up to that event, so many party leaders didn't understand that just not speaking out against something like that ahead of the game would also constitute as a licensing of that, right?
I think there's interesting things in terms of like the role of the spectacle, because visually and symbolically, and certainly for the people who were killed, the breaching of the Capitol is a very grave event. But we also think, like, we know that in terms of the pandemic, we have like excess deaths of hundreds of thousands of lives that if we had, say, gone into stricter pandemic protocols earlier in the year, could have been saved. Things like, we know that people turned away on the back border, on the southern border, were killed. We know that children who've been separated from their parents in the camps at the border are going to have lifelong traumatic results. But somehow all of that was just like able to be like, oh, well, we're still doing business as usual. But then when we have the spectacle of the Capitol, that becomes like the moment that you have some folks now being like, this is a bridge too far. And I don't really know what I think about that, other than, well, I mean, actually what I personally think is that it seems a lot like rats deserting a sinking ship. But I don't know what to think about that in terms of how folks might be kind of narrating their own limits to themselves.
Well, I mean, it's, to me, one thing that, I mean, just from personal experience, it's super painful to be on the wrong side of anything, right? It just is. It's really painful. It's not only embarrassing, but there's a weird sort of response that we all have when we are on the wrong side of any interaction with other humans on a group level or on an individual level, right? So like the poor post office representative in 2007 that I lost my cool with, that still haunts me, right? And I can't take it back. I can apologize, send a card, do all these things, but I can't take it back. And I do feel like, you know, this is a moment where, at least for like any of my family members who supported this idea that the election was a fraud, or which I do have, you know, I'm from Arizona, come on. Very, very different response to the same information. But anyway, for many of them, what I'm hearing is a little bit of regret, not so much shame, but some regret. And that's what I'm saying is, like, you know, ride that emotion out a little, understand what was at stake in your actions to lead to that emotion, and really challenge yourself, but also within our own party, right? So, you know, I do think that, like, there's always going to be this question of strategizing for power, and we can't ever escape from that. It's going to be a pressure that everyone feels in such a politically divided country and in a democracy. That is just the nature of it. There's always going to be this question, like, what is right and what do we need to do to retain power? But I do challenge people to, like, be a little, I like to tell people to be kind to themselves, but in terms of political beliefs, be a little bit rude to yourself too, and just say, like, what if I'm a little wrong? Or maybe there's a different way to get a value that I believe in, you know, manifested in this country. Like, what if there's a different path to this outcome that I think? Being open to just being wrong about our set ways in our political beliefs, I think, is key here on both ends, but also understanding that there is pain at stake, right? That when people are wrong, there's anger, resentment, and a bunch of pain. And so that's a really hard thing to overcome. And it's a really hard thing for us to just assume can ever be rid of. So not to be hopeless, but I'm not going to be like John Stuart Mill level hopeful either and think one day all the ills of society, if we all just play our part, it's going to be okay. It can be better for another generation. Maybe it can be like slightly better in some way. We can maybe make certain things happen in our own communities and in our own neighborhoods, and work on that level to really change things. But that doesn't happen if we just assume we're right about everything. It just doesn't.
Okay.
Sorry, Jim.
Dr. Wright, I do have a few questions.
Great.
Okay, the first one is from Casey Cruz. How can we discern the knowers from people who think they are the knowers?
Casey, I hate to burst your bubble, but we all think we're knowers, and we're probably not. I'm not going to bring up Descartes again, but we could be wrong about a lot of things. I don't know. I think that it's not, I want to change the narrative, because I kind of think that for the most part, a lot of our trouble interacting with one another is that we perceive it as like we're the ones who have knowledge and we're finding truth out there. But maybe we need to flip that script a little and say like, do I have knowledge, and treat everyone in that sort of way, you know, just coming into interactions and saying like, I'm not 100% sure about this, but based on what I've seen, right? Things like that. And then also just asking people for evidence, maybe not in an aggressive way where you might be met with violence or something really scary. Like, don't push people when you're at like a rally, for instance. Not that you go to rallies. Don't push people when you're, honestly, like road rage is a thing, right? Don't push people. If it's a dangerous situation, I don't recommend that. But classes are a great opportunity. One thing I know about William Patterson so far is that in all of the classes, you know, that I've seen offered here or heard about, there is this open platform, a safe space to explore various ideologies, to explore different perspectives. I'm not going to only advertise philosophy, but that's like our specialty, right? We literally never present answers. We just give you different ways of looking at a situation. So I would just maybe say to Casey, it's not about knowing who knows. It's about understanding that we're all in a process of gathering information and doing the best we can. And so being aware of that, and then meeting people with compassion, but also being aware that you're in that process, it might instead make for a better interaction where we are open to learning from one another. And always double check the facts.
I'm gonna like plug the liberal arts framework for that, like, again, so like repositioning ourselves as we can all be knowers, but like learning things about like the nature of argumentation. So like in philosophy, learning about like fallacies, in the social sciences and the natural sciences, thinking about method, like what makes a good study from a bad study. And so like I think about this in terms of like vaccine misinformation a lot. And so like, right, and that's obviously a big deal right now, right? So like how big are the like when we gain skills in terms of like reading scientific research articles, we can do things like look at the N. How many people did they test this on? I actually just got the first dose of the Pfizer vaccine, and I was looking for like, when does it become effective? And the N on one of the studies was 42,000 people. And so after 7 days after the second dose, only 8 out of 42,000 people had gotten COVID. I was like, that's a pretty good number. And so developing those skills, and I really do think they're skills, combined with making sure that you're seeking out a diversity of those skills. So not just relying exclusively on, say, one discipline, but also learning from people whose voices maybe are less represented and have different kinds of methods and different critiques of different method. I mean, I know I'm biased because I'm a professor in the liberal arts, but I think that's a really valuable way to do it.
Okay, we have a tough question coming in. And I guess this one's for both of you. This is from Reindorf Adamako Manu. How do I respond to my middle school daughter whose thinking and positions on things she has read is not far from QAnon?
Interesting. I like that question. I mean, I will just come out with this. My brother is kind of a conspiracy theorist. I mean, like many years ago, he texted me like, please don't eat any canned food for next year because, okay, so how do I respond to that? I mean, I really think just being compassionate, first understand what's at stake. There's a sense of belonging there that really matters. There's also autonomy, right? To be able to go out there and seek information on your own and come to a belief. That's a really special thing. We want our kids to have that ability. Maybe I would suggest just like, you know, being really straight about seeking different sources, finding evidence. Another thing I would do is, so I talk about this with some of my students, is like just talking about like, well, what would that actually entail if this was true, right? What would this actually mean about the society we're living in? One of my colleagues, Pete Mandick, has this paper from long ago that's like, look, the amount of false beliefs, or not just that, beliefs and desires I would have to imagine people are having to make this conspiracy true. It's just kind of like, it's not tracking reality. I'm trying to shortcut to like his conclusion. But the idea is like, how many people need to believe that like it's okay to do these rituals the QAnon are describing? How many people would need to be involved to cover it up? What kind of things would they need to be doing in their lives to successfully cover this up? Like, get into it and just say like, what is the evidence that they are doing this? Bring it to me. I want to hear the evidence. And talking about different sources of evidence too, right? Not just hearing something, but seeing something. So I don't know, that's a really tough situation. But I don't think just telling someone they're crazy or they have false beliefs is ever gonna fix it, right? I think you really need to just like listen and then kind of like start a conversation and just ask, well, why do you believe this? And then maybe compare some of those beliefs to everyday beliefs we rely on to live our lives, right? I have to go to the store to buy milk for my kid. And, you know, I need to make a decision about whether I'm going to like this store or not. What kind of information am I using to make this decision? My past experiences going to the store and seeing milk, right? My ability to call somebody and say, do you have milk in stock? Like, these are ways that we come to have knowledge that guides our actions in the world that are not available to conspiracy theorists, I don't believe. They might have like one or two of those paths. I can go on to a forum, but follow up on that. Well, why is this forum any better than this forum here saying it's false? What is the difference here? Just have a conversation. I'm not going to say you're going to fix this, you know, issue, but it's not, I don't think it's ever a good approach to just tell people they're wrong. I've learned that through my youth and through many bad interactions with my mother-in-law. You gotta just talk to people and see where they're coming from and then ask them questions. Maybe they'll come to have a better way of approaching information. Maybe they won't, but it's worth trying, I think.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Langria, Dr. Wright. Fascinating panel. We're going into another 15-minute break. I want to thank both of you again. I'm learning a lot and appreciate the effort that you put in at just such short notice to get this put together. Jim's going to play the music from WPU's jazz band, and we'll be back right around 12:29 or so.